Chapter 2, Act 2, You Can't Turn Back. Act 2, You Can't Turn Back. Baron was a bustling town that was perched right near the outskirts of Baron Castle. It had always been a place of fond memories for both Cecil and Kane, who would often spend their summers there with Rosa at her house or at Sid's house with his daughter. Since airships had become more and more developed in Baron, the town became deeply immersed in commerce and trade. It made it an even more fun place to be, for the young and old.
I love it here.
Kane grinned as they walked down the cobblestone streets.
We gotta start going to the pub more often, Cecil, you don't get out that much. When I get my job back, then we can go to the pub,
Cecil said, sighing a little.
I really hope King Baron reconsiders things after we come back. I'm kind of worried now. Yeah, Rosa told me you seemed stressed,
Kane said as they stepped into an apothecary to get some healing potions. Cecil didn't say anything, and Kane gave him a strange look before filling out his order at the counter. After he was done, the two sat down, waiting for the owner of the shop to bring them their supplies.
Are you two okay?
Kane asked, and Cecil looked up at him.
Well, I'm not really sure what is going on right now,
Cecil said.
Ever since I came back, it's really hit home that my work is going to become more dangerous. I don't want to put her through that. She doesn't understand though. Cecil, don't be so quick to dismiss her,
Kane said, surprising Cecil a bit. Kane had never really been an advocate for the opposite sex. If anything, he thought women were needy and annoying. Cecil raised his eyebrows and looked over at his friend. Kane looked dead serious.
She wants to be with you. And you want to be with her. Why fight it? I do want to be with her, but I am more rational than she is,
Cecil replied.
It's hard to explain. I want to be with her, but more than that, I want her to be safe and happy. I think that is more important.
Kane smiled some.
Yeah, Cecil, guess what? That means you're in low. High wind. Your order is ready.
Kane cut himself off and stood up, going back up to the counter and getting their stuff. Cecil stood up, shaking his head. After getting everything, the two walked back outside, preparing to investigate the phantom beast. What was it? Cecil and Kane were not sure, but there were many adventurers that passed through the town every day. Hopefully some of them had gone to Mist or come back from the area. For this task, the two decided to split up.
Excuse me,
Cecil said, stopping a young woman inside the pub. The woman turned around and saw Cecil, letting out a little gasp and stepping back.
The Dark Knight. Sir. I've paid all my taxes, I swear.
With that, she turned and bolted out the door. Cecil paused and watched her go, confused. He had absolutely nothing to do with the taxing of Baron. What had she heard? And why did she sound so scared? For some reason, he had a feeling it had something to do with the king. Spotting quite a few people gathered around the bar, he slipped over nonchalantly and tried to overhear conversations that were going as people were served their drinks. Some people were moaning about how lately the king just simply hadn't been himself. Others were remarking that taxes had indeed suddenly shot up for construction of more airships. One person was upset because their wife had been suddenly jailed. Cecil couldn't believe the things he was hearing. Were they really all true? He decided he wouldn't bother any of those people for info about the phantom beast. An hour or so later, the two knights met back up with each other in front of the local inn. Cecil had gotten nothing but an attempted lap dance from a girl by the tiny river that ran through the north side of the town who was practicing to be a special occasion dancer, and a stern talking to from Sid's daughter, Amelia, about making sure Sid didn't overwork himself. Kane didn't come up with anything either.
The phantom beast could just be a legend,
Kane said as they started up the dirt path to Mist Cave.
I mean, it is entirely possible somebody just made it up to keep people away from Mist. Yeah.
Cecil trailed off, half listening. He was still disturbed about what he had heard about the king in town, but he didn't want to burden Kane with any more of his problems for the day. Why is everything in my life as I know it falling apart, right this very moment? The walk to the Mist Cave was very short. It was a simple trail that wound through some of the emerald green fields Baron proudly boasted about. They also passed Chocobo Lake, a pretty little blue lake that was surrounded by cascading waterfalls. Cecil smiled a little as they passed by. He had always imagined taking Rosa there when he was younger to do something romantic, like ask for her hand in marriage. But now...
Cecil, are you listening to me? Hey! I said, we're here.
Kane glared at him.
Get with it. I know you are upset about losing your job, but if you don't cooperate with me here, you're never gonna get it back.
Cecil blinked and looked up. They had made it into a small valley where the path suddenly stopped. Ahead of them was the entrance to the mist cave. It appeared to be pretty dark, but living up to its name, the entryway was also shrouded in fog. Kane pulled out his lance, and Cecil kept his hand on his dark blade. They both knew that monsters had been getting more and more out of control and restless, and that there would be encounters. With Kane leading the way, the two slipped inside. Cecil had to narrow his eyes to see through the thick fog, as he could barely see his hand in front of his face. The sound of precipitation could be heard all around, dripping from the ceiling and into the various little ponds that were scattered throughout the area. The heaviest fog was rising from them, and that was where the monsters of Mist Cave were gathered and sleeping. They were giant, slimy purple larvae, pulsating and gurgling on their own mucus as they slept the day away. They appeared absolutely harmless, except for when they decided to wake up and slime their predators, which usually resulted in them choking to death or drowning. When Cecil and Kane got past them at a far enough distance, one of them would launch a fire or lightning bomb, and make quick work of them in groups. Nearly halfway in through the cave, a wet breathing noise suddenly erupted and hissed.
Turn back now.
Cecil and Kane both gasped, looking around. However, nothing was in front of, behind, or beside them.
Whatever,
Kane said, putting his hands on his hips.
Probably some sort of trick of the wind.
Cecil wanted to remind him that there was no wind, but thought better of it. They continued on, and in under a half hour, approached the final stretch of the cavern. Ahead of him, Cecil could see light, and he knew that they were almost there. As they headed toward the exit, Kane accidentally dropped a lightning bomb, setting it off and creating a loud, thundering explosion with sparks flying everywhere. Cecil coughed and tried to fan the air with his hand, struggling to make it through the exit. As soon as he placed one foot outside, an invisible force threw him back, causing him to cry out and smash right into Kane. They both tumbled over into the remains of the lightning bomb, their ears ringing inside their helmets as the voice from before suddenly returned, louder than ever.
Knights of Baron.
Cecil and Kane both looked up, trying to pull themselves from the ground.
Who are you?
Kane yelled, his voice echoing back at him over and over again.
Leave now and no harm will befall you.
Kane smirked and crossed his arms over his chest.
Confident bastard, aren't you? You refuse.
Yes, Cecil protested.
We have to get to Mist Village, and we are not going back.
There was a soft laughter in reply, and Cecil withdrew his blade.
So be it. The mist is gathering.
Kane gasped. The temperature dropped lower and lower, and suddenly, a whirlwind of mist was forming in front of them. It went faster and faster, when suddenly it burst into the form of a white dragon, with a long, slender neck, and piercing blue eyes. It fluttered the small wings on its back and let out a shriek, swinging its neck and spraying mist over his new enemies. Cecil and Kane managed to dodge just in time, and it was a good thing too. Everything that the mist blew over turned into solid ice.
This must be the Phantom Beast.
Cecil trailed off, but Kane had already jumped into the fray. Sliding across the ice the beast had created, he thrust his lance out and pierced it through its chest, jumping back to view his work. As a dragoon, Kane had incredible leaping skills, and could fight in the air with as much agility as he could on the ground. The dragon started to sway its long neck and cry, slowly melting away into a puddle of water before evaporating away. Kane's lance clattered to the cavern floor, where he went over and retrieved it.
Not bad, Cecil.
Cecil shook his head. He was so out of it, he couldn't even lift his sword to help Kane. He felt disgusted with himself.
Yeah. Not bad, pal. Well, come on, let's hurry.
Kane exclaimed.
We can deliver the ring and go back home. This is the easiest mission we have ever been on,
Cecil followed Kane out of the cave and was relieved to be in sunlight again. They were now completely surrounded by the northern barren mountains. Just a little ways ahead of them was a tiny village, Mist, and behind it were even more mountains. Cecil knew that between those mountains was a little valley path that would lead in through Mist from the east, but not many people took it because it was dangerous. Crossing the gentle green fields, the two men soon came to the edge of town, and could see that it was filled with quaint little homes, goldfish ponds, and a lush community garden filled with vegetables and big heads of lettuce. An elderly man and a young boy were outside, sitting against the back of a tree and reading a book together. A mom came outside, calling for her kids to come in and get their breakfast. A teenage girl saw Cecil and Kane and started to approach them, but Cecil felt something hot burning in his pocket. Reaching down, he quickly fished around, finding only the ring and lifting it out. It was searing his fingers.
Ouch!
He cried, dropping it on the ground and shaking his hand. Kane bent down, touching the ring himself, and jerking back.
What the hell? It feels like that thing is on fire.
He glared at it closer, and widened his eyes.
It's glowing.
Smoke trickled out of the ruby, as it quivered and began to crack. It suddenly burst open, the shards of the jewel flying everywhere and causing Kane to cover his eyes. Their surroundings began to tint a deep red, and smoky explosions burst in the air. Out of them appeared fiery, blazing balls, with glaring fangs and orange, glassy eyes. Cecil recognized them as bombs, fearsome monsters that were born in flame and caused massive destruction when agitated. More and more began to appear, screeching happily and starting to take off around the village. The girl that had been approaching them stopped and screamed, dropping her basket and running for her life. The other villagers began to panic too, and the bombs began to ram their way into any building or tree they could, instantly setting it aflame. In under a minute, all of Mist Village was on fire, and the remaining bombs began to attack the villagers. It was out of anyone's control. Screams rang out and the sickening smell of burning flesh reached Cecil's nostrils.
My God!
Kane gasped, covering his mouth and shuddering. Cecil felt weak in his knees, like he was witnessing the massacre at Mysidia all over again. He knew that if he had had breakfast this morning, it would be on the ground.
This is it? This is why he sent us?
He whimpered, closing his eyes. King Baron sent us to destroy the Mist Village, just like Mysidia. I'm a murderer all over again. In less than 48 hours. Kane felt as if his feet were made of lead. He was paralyzed with wonder and fear all at the same time.
The entire village. In flames.
Gazing down at his hands, Cecil could have sworn that they were slick with glossy, fresh new blood, pouring between his fingers and falling at his feet. He suddenly collapsed down to his knees, panting out and clutching his head, screaming out at the top of his lungs.
Why?
Kane knelt down to try to comfort him, but suddenly, a frightened cry broke out from the roaring of the flames.
Mommy! No!
The voice cut through Cecil's senses, causing him to open his eyes and look to his left. Standing in front of a small home was a little girl, with bright green curly hair and wide emerald eyes. She didn't look more than 7 years old. Dressed in a light blue sundress with a pink bow, she fell to her knees, pulling into her arms the crumpled figure of an older woman. Cecil pulled himself to his feet and ran over to her, Kane following. The little girl looked up at Cecil, tears burning in her eyes.
My mom's dragon died, and she also...
She choked and gasped, clutching her mother's pale head to her lap and wailing. Cecil and Kane looked at each other, their hearts sinking.
What?
So?
She was a summoner.
Kane trailed off.
And that monster was her.
He lowered his head.
God damn. Her mother died because we killed the phantom beast.
Cecil trailed off, and the girl looked up at him, glaring.
You killed my mom's dragon.
Cecil looked down at her, straight into her eyes. There was no way he could not be honest, even if she was just a child.
We didn't know. It was our order to come here.
He shook his head.
I'm so sorry.
Kane stepped up to Cecil, pulling him aside.
The king's wish was to annihilate every summoner in this village. So I'm afraid we're going to have to take care of her too.
Cecil stared at him, widening his eyes. He could not believe what Kane was saying.
What? Shut up.
Kane hissed, nodding towards the little girl, who was still staring up at them hatefully.
I know that it's terrible, but it is the king's orders. She is just a little girl.
Cecil protested.
What can she possibly do? You intend to defy the king?
Kane raised his eyebrows, and Cecil turned away.
I refuse to continue this slaughter, even in the king's name. Damn. I was afraid you would say that.
Kane sighed, and raised his lance. Cecil turned around and gasped, ducking down as Kane suddenly swung his lance hard right for Cecil's head. As Cecil hit the ground, he heard an explosion above him. Looking up, he saw that Cain had just barely managed to skewer a bomb that had been sneaking up behind them. Cain pulled back his lance, twirling it between his fingers.
I guess I'm just going to have to join you.
His heart pounding, Cecil pulled himself up and shook his head. Cain laughed a little and patted him on the shoulder.
Come on Cecil, did you really think I was going to turn against my best friend? After all of this chaos, I don't know what to think anymore,
Cecil snapped.
But Cain. Seriously, think about this. I have thought about it,
Cain said seriously.
I owe the king so much, but I can't disgrace the dragoons with missions like this. Not on my life.
Cecil sighed and looked around.
She is just a little girl.
Cecil protested.
What can she possibly do? You intend to defy the king?
Cain raised his eyebrows, and Cecil turned away.
I refuse to continue this slaughter, even in the king's name. Damn. I was afraid you would say that,
Cain sighed, and raised his lance. Cecil turned around and gasped, ducking down as Cain suddenly swung his lance hard right for Cecil's head. As Cecil hit the ground, he heard an explosion above him. Looking up, he saw that Cain had just barely managed to skewer a bomb that had been sneaking up behind them. Cain pulled back his lance, twirling it between his fingers.
I guess I'm just going to have to join you.
His heart pounding, Cecil pulled himself up and shook his head. Cain laughed a little and patted him on the shoulder.
Come on Cecil, did you really think I was going to turn against my best friend? After all of this chaos, I don't know what to think anymore,
Cecil snapped.
But Cain. Seriously, think about this. I have thought about it,
Cain said seriously.
I owe the king so much, but I can't disgrace the dragoons with missions like this. Not on my life.
Cecil sighed and looked around. Some of the fires had begun to already burn out, but in their place, more were rising and licking at the sky above. The smoke was also starting to get stifling. He knew that they couldn't stay much longer and expect to survive.
You do realize we are Huron traitors,
Cecil said, and Cain nodded, looking a little disappointed.
Yeah. And we're opposing the mightiest kingdom in the land. We'll need allies to survive. And somehow, we have to go back and rescue Rosa.
Rosa? Cecil sighed. He had totally forgotten about her. He hoped that she would manage to stay safe until they could come and get her. Looking up at Cain, he stuck out his hand.
Thanks, friend.
However, Cain did not take his hand. He paused for a moment, and then turned away from Cecil.
Save it. I'm not doing this for you.
Cecil blinked and lowered his hand, not knowing what to think. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, Cain turned back to him.
What should we do with the girl?
He gestured over to her. She remained in the same exact position as before, hugging her mother's dead body and staring daggers at the two invaders.
Well, we're not going to leave her,
Cecil said, and turned to the girl, bending down on one knee and holding out his hand.
It's going to be all right. We're not going to hurt you. Come with us, okay?
The girl snorted and slapped Cecil's hand away, standing up straight and retreating back from her mother's body.
No. Come on.
Cain snapped, diving in to grab her.
We have to go now.
The girl screamed and kicked Cain in the chest as he leaned in, knocking him back a few inches, enough for her to get away. She started running towards the garden, pushing through the flaming vegetables and heading back toward the back valley exit of the town.
Wait!
Cecil cried, starting to run after her. The girl stopped and turned around, fresh tears in her eyes as she raised her hand in the air.
I hate you. You killed my mom.
Her body began to glow a faint yellow, and crystalline bubbles burst from her hand. Cain caught up to Cecil and pulled him away just in time from being crushed by the form that had magically appeared in front of the girl. It was a huge, hulking man with arms the size of Cecil and Cain's bodies, and height as tall as a house. Slamming down on the ground, he proceeded to crack it open, and the whole village began to shake and shudder underneath his strength. Cecil and Cain both were knocked off their feet, and the quakes began to get harder and faster, bouncing them up in the air painfully.
Phantom Beast!
Cain cried, and Cecil struggled to reach down for his sword.
If we don't stop it, everything will get swallowed into the earthquake.
Cecil started to crawl toward the Phantom Beast, and Cain called out for him frantically over the roar of the fire and the shaking ground.
Cecil! Look out!
But by the time Cecil looked up, it was too late. A piece of the stone chimney on the house beside them had fallen down, and it struck him square on the head. His ears ringing, Cecil collapsed to the ground, feeling his head get lighter and his world grow dark. He could hear Kane calling for him, but it sounded like he was getting further and further away.
Cecil? Rosa? Is that you? You have to get up, Cecil. You have to wake up. It started. What? What has started?
Rosa! Cecil gasped, suddenly sitting up and opening his eyes. As his vision cleared, he saw that he was now in a little grove, with a few sparse trees surrounding them and soft green grass. Looking up, he saw a familiar mountain range, and that the sun was setting into the horizon. He guessed by the dew that was covering his body that he had to have been laying there for at least a day, if not more. The question was though, how did he get where he was, and was he alone? The answer to the second question came in a heap a few feet away from him. Curled up on the grass and mumbling in her sleep was the little girl from before, her curls a mess and her skin all cut up and bruised. Cecil was unharmed thanks to his armor, but the girl looked seriously hurt. Crawling over to her, Cecil gently shook her shoulder, but she didn't move an inch. He stood up and took a walk around, checking to see if anyone else was with them, particularly his best friend. Placing his hands around his mouth, he started to call out for him, at first softly and then louder and louder.
Kane! Kane!
He sighed, lowering his hands from his mouth and shaking his head. There was no reply. And he was alone. Coming back over to the girl, he gently picked her up in his arms, holding her against his chest. He had to get her somewhere safe so that she could recover properly. Pushing through the trees, he found himself crossing through what became less and less grass and more sand. Cecil soon realized where he was, and became slightly relieved. It appeared that they had somehow made it into the Capo Desert, which he knew was on the east side of Mist Village, on the other side of the mountains. While the desert was large and usually unbearable in the daylight, it was cool now that night was falling, and Cecil knew exactly how to get to the desert oasis, Capo Village. He had been there on many missions with the Red Wings. He was sure he could find a safe place for the girl to rest there. Eventually, he came to the oasis, which was a village set on the edge of a small pond with palm trees and blooming cacti. Slipping through the stone city gates, the sky now dark and the streets nearly empty, Cecil ran through town to find the inn he had stayed at on his previous trips. Bursting through the doors, he startled the innkeeper, who ran out to meet him.
Welcome, sir.
Oh. He leaned over and peered at the girl.
Is she hurt? Take her inside. There's no charge at all.
Thank you, Cecil sighed, and with that, followed him to a room that was just down the hall. After unlocking the door, the innkeeper gestured for Cecil to come in, and closed it behind him. Cecil walked over to the only bed in the room and gently set the girl upon it, pulling the covers back and smoothing them over her delicate frame. After making her as comfortable as possible, he left the room and went back up to the counter to solicit the innkeeper for a pitcher of water. After getting it, he came back into the room, only to see the girl sitting up in bed and gazing out the window beside her. Coming over with the water in a borrowed glass, he poured some and handed it to the girl. She didn't even look at him.
Hey! Are you okay?
Cecil asked softly. Cecil blinked, flustered behind his helmet. He wasn't very good with kids, and the situation in Mist made this encounter twice as awkward.
My name is Cecil. What's yours?
Cecil sighed, putting the water pitcher and glass down on her nightstand.
Listen. I'm so sorry about your mom. I understand if you can't forgive me. But at least let me protect you. I can't explain everything, because I don't know it all myself. But I want to keep you safe from whatever may be pursuing you.
Cecil turned away, his back to the girl as he got down on the worn rug tossed onto the stone floor, and laid down, using his hands as a pillow. He heard the bed beside him shift, imagining that the little girl was laying down herself. As he tried to assess his situation and think about what he should do tomorrow to find Kane, he let his body give in to sleep. He was still exhausted from the quake.
Cecil. I've finally found you.
Cecil moaned and slowly opened his eyes, sitting up and looking towards the entryway of their room.
Kane. No, you fool, it's me, General Ashby.
Cecil blinked, his eyes focusing as a tall man in a deep crimson uniform stormed in, 3 other men behind him in what he recognized as standard Baron Blue Army uniforms. Cecil stood up, and General Ashby extended his hand. Cecil recognized the man from around the castle, but couldn't say that he had honestly spoken to him on that many occasions. Regardless, Cecil shook his hand, wondering what was going on.
General Ashby. What brings you to Capo? You.
The general exclaimed.
You've been missing for days, do you realize that?
Cecil heard the little girl sit up behind him, letting out a slight gasp.
Well, sir, the king. I'm here on the king's orders,
Ashby interrupted.
All summoners of mist must be annihilated. So please hand over the girl, and then we can take you back home.
Cecil widened his eyes, and the little girl whimpered softly.
No,
Cecil replied firmly. Ashby looked surprised, as did his men. Cecil stood up straighter, and said it again louder.
No, I just can't do that.
Ashby sighed a little and turned to his men, who seemed confused. With a shrug, Ashby withdrew his sword and directed it towards the Dark Knight.
Kill him. Wait.
Cecil cried.
I don't think you understand.
But it was far too late. The men, all withdrawing their blades, began to approach him. Cecil looked back at the girl, and saw that she had curled up against the corner of her bed in the wall, shivering in fear. Looking down, Cecil withdrew his dark sword and held it between his right fist and his left fingertips, the blade beginning to glow a sinister violet.
Dark wave.
Cecil felt a powerful surge jerk up from his legs up to his fingers, the blade projecting sharp, black, blue, and violet blades that flew towards his enemies. Each blade sliced through, the soldiers gagging and crying out as blood dripped from their arms, chests, and stomachs. Cecil staggered a little, feeling his energy level drop dangerously low, but his initial attack was enough for the soldiers. They ran out, screaming and clutching their wounds as the general glared at Cecil and ran out after them. He heard the door of the inn slam shut so hard that it rattled the furniture. Falling back, Cecil collapsed at the edge of the girl's bed, panting out for breath. She blinked and slowly crawled over to him.
Are you okay? Yeah.
Cecil moaned out.
I just need to rest for a moment. That attack drains my energy and uses it offensively. I knew it was the only thing I could do that wouldn't kill them. But don't worry. I won't let anyone hurt you. You promise?
The girl asked softly, and Cecil nodded.
I promise.
The girl paused and closed her eyes, folding her hands together and softly chanted a spell, one that Cecil recognized from hearing Rosa practice it over and over while they were young.
Cure.
A gentle white light sparkled over Cecil's body, and moments later, he felt his energy return, good as new. He sat up, smiling and turning to the girl.
Thanks. I didn't know you knew white magic. I know a little,
the girl replied, looking down at the bed and then looking back up at Cecil.
I'm Rydia. Rydia. That's a pretty name,
Cecil said. There was more silence, and Rydia nervously played with a lock of her hair.
Do you ever take that off?
Cecil asked.
Your helmet,
Rydia pointed up towards Cecil's head.
Do you ever take it off? Oh, well, of course,
Cecil said, reaching up and unfastening it. Pulling it off, he handed it to her, and she took it, feeling the weight with her skinny arms. See?
You look much better without it,
Rydia said, gazing over Cecil's face and hair.
People can see your eyes.
Cecil blushed.
Well, I'll tell you a secret. I've never really liked my eyes. No.
Rydia blinked incredulously.
But they're so blue. I know,
Cecil laughed.
Blue and girly. They aren't girly.
Rydia laughed too.
They suit you perfectly. Well, thanks.
Cecil shook his head.
But, I think that's enough chatting for tonight. You really need to get your rest. I promise we can talk tomorrow. What are we going to do tomorrow?
Rydia asked, sitting back and pulling up her covers.
I'm not really sure,
Cecil said, sighing.
We need to find Kane. You know, the man who was with me before? After we find him, we can figure out where to go to find allies to fight Baron, and meanwhile, we still need to rescue Rosa, and...
He heard a gentle snoring, and looked back over at Rydia. She was snuggled against her pillows, and fast asleep. Cecil smiled a little and got up off the bed, taking his helmet and setting it down beside the rug. After getting as comfortable as one can get on a rug, Cecil closed his eyes.
Good night, Rydia. Triple M. Good night, Cecil.
The following morning, Rydia woke up bright and early, washing her face and cuts with the water Cecil brought. She then kneeled over beside him and gently shook his shoulder.
Good morning, Cecil. Good morning.
Cecil groaned and rolled over, rubbing his eyes and yawning.
Morning. Come on. We have to find Kane. All right. I'm coming.
After Cecil had situated himself and pulled his helmet back on, they left the inn, thanking the innkeeper again and going outside to check out their surroundings. The weather was extra hot and dry, and the sun was already hanging high overhead. A gentle wind blew through, sand running over Cecil's boots and Rydia's sandals. As they passed people on the street, both Cecil and Rydia asked if a dragoon had passed by, but no one knew anything. Rydia ran up to a young girl sitting at the edge of a little pond as Cecil stepped into a pub, tapping her shoulder.
Excuse me. Has a dragoon been in town?
The girl looked up at Rydia and shook her head.
No, miss. Awfully weird that you ask though. It seems that all sorts of people have been going missing since last week. What do you mean?
Rydia blinked, sitting down beside the girl. The girl flipped her hair back and sighed.
Well, you know about Prince Edward Damsion, right? Sure I do,
Rydia nodded enthusiastically.
He's the prince that rules over this village, right? He's so handsome, and he sings as beautifully as a bard. Well, the prince has disappeared from his castle.
The girl exclaimed.
And so has his fiancée, Miss Anna. I know, because Miss Anna's father Tella turned the village upside down looking for them. Oh no.
Rydia trailed off.
How terrible. I hope they find him soon. Me too,
the girl sighed.
We all miss Prince Edward. He would always come to town and sing for me and my friends.
Rydia climbed to her feet, coughing a little and gazing at the pond thirstily. She decided it was time for a drink. As she walked back to the pub, she saw Cecil stepping outside, and ran up to him.
Did you find out anything? Hardly.
Cecil shook his head.
Everyone here is in an uproar because Prince Edward has disappeared. I just talked to someone about that,
Rydia said.
Do you know Prince Edward? No, can't say I know any royals,
Cecil said, and started to continue down the street. Rydia tugged on his arm.
Hold on Cecil, let's go back into the pub. I'm thirsty. I don't have any money.
Sorry, Cecil said, turning back to her. Rydia squirmed and rubbed her throat.
I really don't. Kane had all our money on him. But Cecil...
She paused as they passed a house.
Can't we just ask someone for a free drink? I mean, we're in the desert. I don't know about asking strangers for a free drink,
Cecil began, but Rydia had already run over to the house, pounding on the door. Cecil groaned and turned to catch up to her, just as the door opened. A woman dressed in a long, light blue dress appeared, her brown hair wrapped up in a messy bun. Wiping her hands on her apron, she smiled and bent down to Rydia's level.
Hi sweetie, what can I do for you? I'm really thirsty,
Rydia said in a sickeningly sweet tone. Cecil rolled his eyes from the safety of his helmet.
Could I have a drink? Rydia,
Cecil barked.
What did I tell you? Oh sir, your daughter is just too adorable,
the woman laughed, and stood up.
Please come in, both of you. I have tea on the stove.
Rydia looked back at Cecil, sticking out her tongue, and hurried inside. Cecil raised his eyebrows and followed, the woman pulling out 2 chairs for them before returning to her stove. Daughter? I'm only 20.
Honey, who was at the door?
A male voice called from upstairs.
Just some travelers who need a drink, dear.
The woman called back, and reached up in a cabinet to pull down 2 mugs. As she poured the tea, a man came down the steps, pushing his flaxen hair back and smiling.
Hello,
he said, taking a seat beside Rydia.
Who are you guys? I'm Rydia, and this is Cecil, my daddy.
Cecil grunted, and Rydia laughed happily. Cecil and the man shook hands, and the woman came over, setting down a mug of steaming tea in front of each setting.
Cecil, hey? Must be a popular name. How so?
Cecil blinked, pulling off his helmet so he could sip on the tea.
Oh dear, it's terrible,
the man's wife said, sitting down beside Rydia and gently tousling her hair.
This morning, a young girl collapsed in the street in front of our house. As my husband took her inside to rest in our guest room, all she could do was moan and cry. The only word we could make out was the name Cecil.
What? Cecil trailed off, nearly dropping his mug.
Where is she now? She's still upstairs,
the woman replied, and Cecil jumped up, his hip hitting the table and causing the dishes on it to rattle and shake as he bolted out of the kitchen and ran up the staircase.
Cecil!
Rydia cried, leaping from her seat and running behind him. Please, please God. Let me be wrong. Cecil silently pleaded, turning and going through the first open door he saw in the upstairs hallway. It was a beautiful room, with the window wide open, filling it with a pleasant summer breeze. In the corner was a single bed, a coughing form curled up under the covers. Cecil approached the bed, his heart pounding, and slowly pulled back the covers. Rydia appeared in the doorway, panting for breath.
Cecil! Oh God!
Cecil moaned, suddenly stepping back and resting his hand over his chest.
No.
He closed his eyes and collapsed on the chair beside the bed, covering his face. Rydia slowly approached the bed and peeked under the covers, blinking.
Cecil! Do you know this girl?
A few moments later the man and his wife came upstairs, the wife waiting in the doorway as the man came over, carrying a fresh compress and placing it on the girl's forehead in bed. Cecil looked up, reaching over and gently pushing back the gold locks in her face.
Yeah. I know her.
Cecil sighed, his heart pounding harder.
This is... my...
He moaned and bit down on his lip.
Rosa.
She was curled up in the bed, her face ashen and pale, with dark pink circles around her eyes. Her hair was matted and pulled up in a tangled ponytail, and someone had taken off her favorite crystal tiara and placed it on the table next to her. Her lips were dried and chapped, which suddenly burst open with a violent cough that shook her entire body. Her compress slipped off, and when Cecil reached up to replace it, he winced. Her forehead was on fire.
Cecil!
Rydia sighed, holding onto his arm and turning towards their hosts.
What's wrong with her?
The man sighed, going over to the bookcase on the opposite side of the room and pulling down a book. Flipping through a few pages, he gently showed it to Cecil, who glanced at it and then quickly turned back to Rosa, clutching both her hands in his. Rydia took the book and narrowed her eyes, sounding the words out loud slowly.
Day. E-R-T. F-E. Ver.
She looked back up.
Desert fever. It is quite an ailment.
The man said gently, taking the book back and reading down the page.
I believe this is the proper diagnosis. She has all the symptoms, and then some. Violent shivers. Coughing up blood. Constantly dehydrated despite what we have been giving her. High fever.
He shut the book and looked down at Cecil.
She's been out of it ever since we found her, so we couldn't ask her much. But you think she was looking for you? She must have been,
Cecil sighed.
She comes from Baron. Her trip must have been difficult,
the woman sighed.
The passage to here from Mist was ravaged by some geological accident a few days ago. I can't imagine how she managed to get through to Capo.
Cecil closed his eyes, squeezing Rosa's hands tighter. She coughed again and slowly opened her eyes, her lips forming a tiny smile.
Cecil.
Cecil opened his eyes and gasped, leaning in and gently touching his nose to hers, whispering.
Rosa. How are you feeling? Triple M. Cecil.
Rosa sighed and closed her eyes again, pulling her hands away and rolling over. Cecil sighed and sat back, clearing his throat.
So? What can we do? Well, there is a cure,
the man replied, and went back to shelve his book.
She will need something called the sand ruby. It is a substance that is created when an antlion lays its eggs. Where can we find it? Well, the nearest antlion nest is up north, by Damsayan Castle,
the wife said, stepping inside and pushing her hair back.
The only problem is you will need a member of the royal family to take you to the nest. They are the only ones who have the ability to tame the antlions and obtain the sand ruby.
She paused.
Prince Edward is missing, but he has several cousins who live there that would be glad to assist, I am sure. Especially since this is an emergency. You'll have to go through the water cavern to the north,
the man added.
But the exit to that is being blocked by horrible sea snakes. You might have to wait a few days before they decide to leave. Well, I'm not waiting. I'm going to Damsayan right now.
Cecil said gruffly, standing up and pushing past the man and his wife.
Please look after Rosa and Rydia for me until I return. Cecil, wait.
Rydia cried, following him.
Please, take me with you.
Cecil whirled around angrily.
Absolutely not. This is my problem, not yours. You have to take me with you.
Rydia snapped.
Did you hear him? There are going to be monsters. You don't have any magic, and you won't make it through alive.
She pouted and grabbed his hand.
Besides, you promised you would protect me.
Cecil sighed, closing his eyes and trying to clear his mind. Of course, he knew what she was saying was right. He couldn't take out what happened on Rydia, she was only trying to help. He knew he couldn't leave her. If Baronian guards came to this house to murder Rydia and the innocent family that lived there, he would never be able to forgive himself.
All right. I'm sorry Rydia,
Cecil said softly.
You're right. We should go together. Oh dear.
The woman fanned herself and took Cecil by the arm.
Come downstairs with me dear, I'll pack some things for yourself and your daughter. It will take a few days to get through the water cavern. You need to be prepared.
She rushed downstairs, Rydia following her. The man looked up at Cecil and nodded, exiting the room and following his wife and Rydia. Cecil turned and faced Rosa, who had started coughing again. She whimpered and clung to her pillow, closing her eyes tighter and gasping.
Cecil! Don't leave me!
Cecil bit down on his lip and walked back over to the bed, bending down and lightly kissing her forehead. Just the 5-second touch burned his lips.
I have to go for now Rosa. But I swear. I will come back for you. So please. Wait for me.
He stood up, adjusted her compress once last time, and started towards the door, her loud coughing causing him to wince. Stepping outside, he softly closed it behind him and started down the stairs, feeling numb all over. I'll save you Rosa. I promise. End of chapter. Chapter end.